have your Bibles, turn to Matthew chapter 15. Today we're going to continue talking about purity, and that was our current series. And today we're going to be talking about pure hearts, pure hearts. Last week I ended. We were talking about our motivations, and I ended with the idea that the way we have the right motivation is when our hearts are close to God's heart. And so we're going to continue on talking about the heart and this also has a lot to do with character. I was reading a story by Bruce Larson. He was talking about growing up in Chicago, and when he grew up in Chicago, his parents would take him to this big Presbyterian church downtown Chicago, and it was just this beautiful building. It had the Gothic architecture, and you walk in, you couldn't help but be amazed just by the building. And you would go in, and they had great preachers there. These are the famous preachers that people knew throughout the country, and they would listen to these sermons. But he said this is the thing. He said the highlight was when they took up the offering, and I would watch all the ushers come down. And he said the reason was there was one of the ushers that his dad pointed out to him, and he would notice him every single week, and it was a layman, and his name was Frank Loesch. I have a picture of him here, and he said that he would watch him doing his duty as an usher, taking up the offering every week in his church. And they were impressed because Frank Loesch was a man of integrity. He was a lawyer by trade, and as a lawyer, he had done some work with the city of Chicago, and he had been dismayed by the level of corruption that they found. And it really bothered him, and he started to do whatever he could to try and bring justice and law and order into the city. And in fact, he was one of the founders of an organization that was called the Chicago Crime Commission. And it was made up of business leaders in the community. And it became a very powerful organization that tried to deal with the crime in the city. Now, in Frank Loesch's time, crime was really bad. There was a man that you might have heard of named Al Capone. And he was causing a lot of problems. And the Chicago Crime Committee and Frank Loesch did all they could to fight him. In fact, Frank even went to Washington, D.C. and talked to President Hoover as they asked the federal government for help because the city of Chicago couldn't handle it on their own. And so that's when, the history, Eliot Ness and all those people showed up. But it was because of Frank Loesch and people like him. And the thing that was interesting, he did this under a very difficult circumstance. He had people that were trying to kill him. He would receive death threats because of his work. But he believed in integrity. He was a man of character. And Larson said that every Sunday they would go and they would see that man knowing what he was going through and all the flack he was getting and realize this is a man that made the highlight of his week. They say that the state of Illinois, whenever they needed an honest prosecutor, they learned to turn to Frank Loesch. And I think good character like that comes from a pure heart. Let's read the passage today. Matthew chapter 15, beginning in verse 10. Jesus called the crowd to him and said, "Listen and understand. What goes into someone's mouth does not defile them, but what comes out of their mouth is what defiles them." Then the disciples came to him and asked, "Do you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this. He replied, "Every plant that my heavenly Father did not plant will be pulled up by the roots. Leave them. They are blind guides. If the blind lead the blind, both will fall into a pit." Peter said, "Explain the parable to us." "Are you still so dull?" Jesus asked them. "Don't you see that whatever enters the mouth goes into the stomach and then out of the body? But the things that come out of a person's mouth come from the heart, and these defile them. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, slander. These are what defile a person, but eating with unwashed hands does not defile them." Well, let's look at this a little bit closer. And in your notes, I have the first section is titled "The Ritual and Ceremonial Religion." The Pharisees are offended because observing the rituals and ceremonies was what they considered to be true religion. Now, we need to understand that this was a big thing. And what's happening is Jesus is completely overturning everything they knew about religion. This is what it was about for them. It was about practicing the rituals, doing the ceremonies, making sure that you did all those things right. And as long as you did all those things right, everything was fine. And here comes Jesus, and he starts saying this stuff, and they're saying, "Wait a second. We're experts in this. I mean, we major in this stuff, this doing the ceremony and the ritual stuff. We're good at this. We have this down pat. And you're coming in and you're just throwing that all out." And so they're very offended at what's going on. And it's interesting, today we have a lot of people that feel the same way. And maybe it's not even religious, but it's this idea that if I do enough good things, if I volunteer enough, if I give enough, if I do this and that, everything's okay. I've basically gone through the rituals, and I'm okay. And we get that feeling that that's what it is. And I tell you, that's something that deep down we know is not right, and it bothers us. It bothers a lot of people. In fact, I think it was Mark Twain who said he'd been around enough good people that he understood why Jesus liked to hang out with sinners and tax collectors. It's kind of harsh. But we have a lot of that. It still comes through today. The second point we have there is the Pharisees were very proud of their religious practice. And I want to make sure we understand this, because pride is a huge problem. We struggle with pride. And man, we struggle with pride a lot more than we think. And we like to cover our mistakes up. We don't want people to know our mistakes. We don't want to be out there. We don't want people to see that stuff. We try and keep that hidden. And the reason we try and keep that hidden oftentimes is because of pride. There's an old story about Uncle Zeke. And Uncle Zeke was a guy that had a lot of pride. And one day he went walking into town, and he went to visit the blacksmith. And the blacksmith had been working on a horseshoe, and it was been causing problems, and he had that thing in red hot, and he'd been working away on it, and it wasn't working quite right, and so he was going to start over with a fresh shoe. And this one, it was still hot. It wasn't red hot anymore, but it was still hot. But in disgust, he just threw it on the floor and went to get another one. And about that time, Uncle Zeke walked in, and he saw that horseshoe on the floor, and he picked it up, and he dropped it again really quick. And the blacksmith looked at him and said, "Kind of hot, wasn't it?" And Uncle Zeke said, "Oh no, I just look at horseshoes really quick." We get that kind of pride, and we don't like to admit when we make mistakes or could be wrong. I also want us to understand that this isn't anything new. Was foundational to Jesus' ministry, his teaching. And I have there, Jesus taught that blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And that's from Matthew 5:8. We talked about that last year. But notice that, Matthew 5:8, that's in the Sermon on the Mount. So Jesus has been at this for a long time. He said it back then, but they didn't really see the significance of what he said back then, apparently. Because he's basically saying the same thing now, and now they're offended. Because he's actually showing how that applies. The next thing I want us to see is the judgment language. If you notice in there, Jesus said in verse 13, he says, every plant that my heavenly Father has not planted will be pulled up by the roots. Leave them, they are blind guides. If the blind lead the blind, both will fall into a pit. And what I want you to understand is that language of uprooting, blind, and leading others astray are all standard Old Testament judgment language. We don't notice it so much because we're not that versed in it. We don't spend all of our time reading the Old Testament. But for the Hebrews, or for any Jewish person, they would have understood it very well, and they would have recognized it and seen it. And so as soon as they hear these words, they say, wait a second, he's talking about all the judgment we read about back in the Old Testament. And so it's interesting that Jesus brings these words up. What he's doing, what I'm trying to say is Jesus is really getting in their face about this. This isn't just a little thing. This is just, hey, I'm serious here. Wake up. And so when we see these kinds of phrases, we need to represent that or understand that. The other thing that we need to understand is that the Pharisees represented the majority opinion. We like to think that we're independent. We like to think that we don't follow the crowd. But we do. Man. I mean, you look at it, everything from the clothes we wear to our hair, all that stuff. I remember I was clean shaven for a while. And then I got a beard, and that was okay, finally. Every now and then I'll have a suit on, and people will come up to me and they'll say, oh, that looks nice. You ought to wear a suit more often. I don't mind wearing a suit, but there's one thing about a suit that I just don't get, and that's a tie. It just seems so ridiculous. What does it do? I just don't know. And I've heard different things. Keeps your buttons clean. I don't know. Keeps you, so you got something that you can wipe your face with. I'm not sure. But we wear a tie. Why do people wear ties? Because that's what you're supposed to do. I don't know. But we do that. We follow things. And if you don't think you follow, I got news for you. You do. And we like to say that we're independent. But we're not. And Jesus is saying something here that is, everybody in that crowd is agreeing with the Pharisees. It's about these rituals. It's about these ceremonies. Why aren't your disciples washing their hands and things like that? That's what everybody was wondering. And Jesus is coming in here with something that's really new. He's upturning everything, and he's looking at their faith differently. When was the last time you looked at your faith, your relationship with Jesus differently? Because a lot of people thought, oh, it's just about being a good, being labeled a Christian. It's going to church. Doing things, volunteering at church and putting in your time. And when we think, when we start hearing things like, no, it's about a relationship with Jesus, sometimes that just goes right over our head. And what we need to understand that this is exactly what Jesus is saying. He's saying something that is very new that everybody would have really struggled with. And so we got to be very, very careful that we don't just follow along with the crowd and just don't, just go through the motions. Just, this is what's expected. I don't have to do anything. And along with that, I want to say this too. Be very careful about the words we like. There are certain words in society that we like to hear, and they're important words. A good one is freedom. We love freedom, don't we? And here's the thing. We've gotten to the place where as long as you attach freedom, we used to accuse Christian music of this back in the 70s, and people still do. We used to say back then, as long as they put Jesus in the words, it was good. We'd say, all right, that was a great song. And sometimes you'd hear a really bad song, but as long as the words were good, we'd say it was good. No, it really isn't art. But we do that with things like freedom. So now I hear things like reproductive freedom, and quickly people are ready to run to something like that because of the word freedom. And when I read it, I don't see very much freedom in that. So we got to be careful about those kinds of things. Jesus is telling his disciples to ignore the Pharisees' power because their judgment day was coming. And what I want us to understand is that Jesus is getting them out of the here and now. I mean, this is a thing. He's gone and he's let me just go back and read verse 12. Then the disciples came to him and asked, "Do you know that the Pharisees are offended when they heard this?" You see what's happening, don't you? Jesus is stirring the pot in a big way. And the disciples are worried. Hey, Jesus, do you know that what you're saying? I mean, that's not going down well. I mean, have you ever done something like, you go into East Lansing wearing maize and blue, or maize, and to see how people respond? It doesn't go down that well sometimes. What Jesus is saying is something that was dangerous. And the disciples are worried about it being dangerous right in the moment, and maybe even in that next day and that week and that month. And Jesus is saying, don't worry about that. You got to have eternity in mind. And so Jesus is telling them, don't worry about the power of the Pharisees. And that's just a temporal thing. And we do the same thing. We focus so much on right now that we have a hard time making sure we have an eternal perspective. Well, let's talk about pure hearts. Jesus is making sure that they understand you don't do bad things because of something you ate. Now, this seems like it's obvious, but I mean, think about how ridiculous it really is. So Jim, bless his heart, he brought the windmill cookies. They're up there. I don't know if there's any left. See, it's not like you go and eat a windmill cookie and that makes you go and lose your temper and cuss somebody out this afternoon. And that's what Jesus is pointing out. He's saying, think about this, think this through. In fact, by the way, I didn't go into it, but verse 17, don't you see that whatever enters the mouth goes into the stomach and then out of the body? It's rather coarse language there, and it's not something you would expect somebody like a rabbi to say. But Jesus is making sure that they got the point. In fact, Jesus is very clear, the next thing in your notes is very clear that the source of evil is our hearts. We just had a World Series conclude yesterday or last night. I don't know what time. I just read about it this morning. And a lot of people call it the American pastime. I don't think it's I think that America's pastime is being critical. It's just what I think. But a close second to being critical is blaming. We love to blame. And you know, we do this when it comes to how we behave and when we do evil things. We try to find some reason that we can blame so that we don't have to take responsibility for it. Chuck Swindoll, he used to say there's two words in the English language that Christians need to be very careful of, that they use the right one. And those two words are can't and won't. Because what we like to do is use the word can't. I can't get along with my spouse. I can't control my temper. I can't be totally honest in my business. He says what we actually should use most of the time is the word won't. I won't get along with my spouse. You see, a lot of the times we don't want to use won't because that means we're the problem. And we don't want to deal with that. And so we find something else to blame. And so Jesus is very clear with that. And so that leads us to a question: what is polluting your heart? What is polluting your heart? And this is something that every single one of us has to think about for ourselves. I don't know what it is. You know, and here's the thing. There could be something that's totally fine for everybody else, but it's a problem for you. Maybe it's the type of literature you like to read. Maybe it's something that you shouldn't be reading. Maybe it's a television show that you like to watch. And maybe it's not something that's really good for you. Maybe it's okay for somebody else, but it's not good for you. Maybe it's a radio, somebody on the radio that you listen to hour after hour after hour. And maybe they don't say anything that's not true. Maybe everything they say is accurate, but maybe they're negative all the time. And it's amazing how many times I see people and they are just angry with everybody. And the one constant that I hear from them is that they're listening to a certain radio hours and hours and hours and hours a day. Well, maybe it's a problem. It can even be music. You know, sometimes there's people that they just, you know, it's whatever music they listen to, it's just, you know, it's just the anger is in the music and it's just, it affects them. So the question is, what is polluting your mind? Well, the too long didn't listen. Cultivating a pure heart is essential for following Jesus. You know, it's not about winning on a technicality. You ever see that in sports? You know that I played soccer, I coach soccer, I'm a soccer fanatic. And one of the things that, one of the negative things that I have to deal with talking to people who don't like soccer is they talk about the flopping. Josh is here. Why aren't you reffing today, by the way? It's that time of year. It's almost over, though. But sometimes you'll see a team and they're playing, and there's two teams and there's playing, and one is obviously much better than the other, and sometimes the team that's worse will win on a technicality. I was reading a book. It was about baseball, and apparently they claim, they're not really sure about this, I don't think, but apparently the first night game, baseball game, was played in Fort Wayne, Indiana, because GE was there, and they lit up a field, and they had this game, and they had this night game. But they were talking about baseball back in the old days. And they said the umpire there, he was the absolute authority. And his main goal was just making sure that it was fair for both sides. And they wouldn't take any guff. They said the umpires back then would fine players on the spot. They would he'd come in, they'd call it out. Guy thought he was safe, and how it is now. They jump up and they argue and they, all that. They said back then the ump would, fine him 25 cents, which meant something back then. But, the guy'd have to pay before he could keep playing. But the goal was that it would be fair, that you had two teams that would compete, and they would have a fair game. It wouldn't be anything about a technicality. And so now when I see soccer and I see they have video assistant refereeing and all this stuff, and it just makes me sick. But see, here's the point. Sometimes people want to get on God's good side or get to heaven or whatever it might be, and they want to do it on a technicality. But it's not about a technicality. It's about our hearts. You see, people like Frank Loesch, that doesn't come from somebody just thinking, I want to just fake it. That comes from things down deep in their heart that determined what he was going to be, the kind of person he was going to be, the kind of character that he was going to have. And that's why cultivating a pure heart is essential for following Jesus. Would you bow your head?